This is the Asus Strix RTX 3090, the top dog, Nvidia's BF GPU, but does it actually deserve such a bold title? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Hey, if you enjoy content like this, drop a like, make sure to subscribe, and smash that bell so you never miss another video. Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel and I hope you've all been doing well. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at a monster of a graphics card, the ROG Strix RTX 3090 from Asus. The RTX 3090 is sitting at the top of the stack when looking at the entire RTX 30 series lineup so far when it comes to performance and also price. Speaking of the latter, this Strix model in particular is one of the more expensive RTX 3090s out there on the market. With the recent US trade tariffs, Asus has increased the MSRP of this model significantly, where now they are listing it for a whopping $2,000 US. That is a significant markup from Nvidia's official MSRP of their Founders Edition model of $1,499, which was already considered quite expensive. Here in Canada, this model is listed for around $2,700 to $2,800, which is just insane considering you can build an entire gaming PC with that much money. So yeah, it's a lot of money. I never in my life thought we'd be seeing consumer-grade graphics cards go for this much, and I didn't think people would be actually buying them, but we also live in a world where folks upgrade their $1,200 phones every couple of years, so here we are. Anyways, as for performance, we'll talk more in detail about that later on in the video, once we've gone over all the benchmark results in this review. So with that said, let's get on with it. To start off, we'll be looking at the aesthetics and design of the card. In terms of aesthetics, this is a really good looking graphics card. Asus has gone with a pretty unique design here with an overall straightforward silhouette. Though this is a very large and bulky card, which makes sense considering the high TDP and power limit of the GPU. You need a good cooling solution to keep this GPU cool. The ROG Strix 3090 measures 31.85 centimeters in length, is 14 centimeters in width, and is 5.78 centimeters thick, essentially taking up 3 slots. It's also pretty heavy too, weighing in at 1565 grams, so beware of its large size. You'll want to make sure you have a large case that can accommodate it. Looking at the shroud, we have these gray and silver aluminum accents and stripes that run throughout the front portion of the shroud, which in my opinion look quite nice and make the card stand out. Those angles of the stripes and chamfered corners of the shroud are also a nice touch. It also complements the black plastic that makes up majority of the shroud as well as its base, which I'm not going to lie, I was a bit surprised to see as I thought they would have gone for an all aluminum shroud for the entire construction, but with that said, it did feel quite sturdy and robust, very well put together, which gave it a nice premium finish. We of course can't ignore the 3 large 90mm fans which provide lots of airflow to the heatsink, which cools off that behemoth of a GPU. The fan in the middle also spins in the opposite direction, spinning clockwise, while the other 2 spin counterclockwise, for which Asus claims this helps reduce turbulence and creates a more effective airflow design. At the top of the card, we have a GeForce RTX brand plate, and a very long RGB LED light bar that's been integrated nicely with the rest of the shroud, and I've gotta say it does make the card look pretty nice if that's your sort of thing, but of course you can opt to turn it off completely, and even then the card looks pretty good. Moving around to the back, we've got a metal backplate which continues that silver aluminum on black accented design as we saw on the front of the card, so that's nice. Near the end you can see a rather large cutout where air can pass freely through the heatsink, a design choice that was no doubt inspired by Nvidia's Founders Edition model. On top of that, you might have also noticed 3 8-pin power connectors, and you can see the way they've been sort of recessed into the card. At first I didn't like that because it did make connecting the cables a little bit more difficult, but it does help hide those ugly plastic connectors and makes it look rather seamless. At the I/O, we have a vent for further airflow facilitation, and 2 HDMI 2.1 connectors and 3 DisplayPort 1.4a connectors. Taking a closer look at the heatsink allows us to see that Asus has gone with a pretty bulky fin stack that has 7 copper heat pipes running throughout the length of the card to maximize cooling. Along with that, we can see Asus has opted for a nice clean copper base plate that directly cools the GPU die to allow for thorough contact and so that it can efficiently cool it. I remember the MSI RTX 3080 did not use a copper base plate, and rather they just used direct touch copper heat pipes. While the heat pipes did do a decent job of taking away the heat, they can sometimes cause hotspots as they don't make smooth contact with the GPU die, whereas a base plate can. So I'm glad Asus implemented that with their cooler. So overall, in terms of design and aesthetics, Asus have knocked it out of the park. As you guys will see later on with thermals, the cooler is very effective, and visually I really like the way the card looks, and the RGB implementation makes the card pop in any case. Shifting our focus to the PCB, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to do my own teardown, but Tech Power Up had put up some nice high-res images on their site, which saved me the trouble. Just like with the cooler and shroud, Asus have done an excellent job with the PCB and its components. For the GPU, they're using an 18-phase VRM utilizing premium Texas Instruments CSD 95481 RWJ power stages, rated for 60 amps, regulated by two monolithic power systems MP, two 888A 10-phase controllers. For the memory, they're using a 4-phase VRM controlled by UPI UP 9512Q controllers. So pretty high quality stuff, which for a card like this was warranted considering how much power it uses. Asus definitely hasn't disappointed us in regards to the choice of components being utilized here. The Asus Strix RTX 3090 is a very well built graphics card. You're getting excellent cooling here, great power delivery from the components, and visually the card is very attractive. Let's move on to the specifications. The RTX 3090 is powered by Nvidia's Ampere architecture. Now, if you guys want to know more about the changes they brought with Ampere, I highly recommend reading their white paper, and I have covered some of that information in my previous videos. The RTX 3090 is based on the GA102 chip, manufactured on Samsung's 8nm process, and has a die size of 628mm square, which is pretty large. The GPU is packing a whopping 10,496 CUDA cores with an SM count of 82, 328 texture mapping units, and 112 render output units. The RTX 3090 also has dedicated ray tracing hardware, where it comes with 82 2nd-gen RT cores, and it also has 328 3rd-gen Tensor cores, which are used for features like DLSS. This model has a base clock of 1395 MHz and a boost clock of 1860 MHz. In terms of memory, the card comes with a very large memory buffer, 24GB of GDDR6X that runs at a speed of 19.5 gigabits per second, sporting a 384-bit memory bus. As for power specs, the card out of the box has a limit of 390 watts, but can be raised to a maximum of 480 watts using programs like Asus AI Tweak or MSI Afterburner. Asus has also recommended using the card with an 850 watt power supply, and if you're overclocking, I highly recommend sticking with that requirement, especially if you're using a high core count power hungry CPU. And trust me, when we take a look at power consumption later on, you'll see that this card is one power hungry monstrosity. But in regards to the power limit and TDP, that is significantly higher than the MSI RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio, which has a 350 watt power limit. So out of the box, that's an extra 12% increase. And with the power slider maxed, you're looking at a 37% difference. So on paper, the RTX 3090 seems very impressive, but the benchmark results will help us validate that. Moving forward, let's do a quick rundown of the test system I will be using to test the RTX 3090. For the CPU, we've got an AMD Ryzen 7 3800 XT, cooled by a Corsair H115i Pro XT 280mm all-in-one liquid cooler. For the RAM, we've got 16GB of G.Skill Trident Z memory, running at 3600 MHz with CL15 timings. The motherboard is an MSI MEG X570 Unify. For our storage device, we've got a 2TB Samsung 970 Evo Plus NVMe SSD. Powering the entire system is an EVGA G3 1000W 80 plus gold power supply. If you're interested in full system specs, check the video description down below. Now that we've gotten specifications for the GPU and test system out of the way, it's time we finally jumped into the performance data and benchmarks. And in the benchmark results, you'll also see data from the other GPUs I've tested, so you can get a good idea of how the top of the line RTX 3090 stacks up against the RTX 3080 or the mid-range RTX 3060 Ti. To begin with, what I wanted to first go over was the frequency behavior of the Asus Strix RTX 3090 and see how it performs out of the box. For this test, Hitman 2 was used with gameplay for about half an hour, so that would allow us to see what kind of frequency behavior the card would exhibit under a real-world load, and allow us to validate advertised specs. Also, keep in mind this card does come with a BIOS switch where you can switch between a quiet or performance BIOS, and I opted for the performance BIOS as that's what the card comes pre-configured with out of the box. At stock, the RTX 3090 Strix maintains an average boost frequency of around 1820 MHz, which is quite a bit lower than where I was expecting it to be, and that's also lower than the stock boost frequency that Asus lists for this particular model. But remember, it's an up to figure, so you're not actually guaranteed to see those figures, and it'll vary depending on the load. Still, when compared to both the RTX 3060 Ti and RTX 3080, both of which boosted well above the manufacturer's advertised boost specification out of the box, I was expecting this GPU to at least average around 1900 MHz on its own. We weren't thermal throttled either, far from it in fact, but this card is just, I guess, power starved. On the graph, you guys can note how most of the time the card's core clocks are hovering around the low 1800s with spikes near or above 1900 MHz. When overclocked, the GPU maintains an average boost frequency of around 1960 MHz, and now we're seeing figures quite a bit higher than what was advertised. Although, with the expense of a lot of power, which may not even be worth it to you as you'll see later. But looking at the graph, we can see the card's core clocks now with this OC hover around the mid 1900s and spiking above 2 GHz or even close to 2.1 GHz. Still, this is a little bit underwhelming to see as my 3060 Ti would maintain clock speeds above 2100 MHz with its OC, and the 3080 would also maintain its boost in the high 2000s or around 2100 MHz range. Again, this could be due to a combination of things such as power limitations and also me just losing the silicon lottery. But I suspect that with some tweaking I could probably get a nice undervolt with this GPU, so be on the lookout for some future content surrounding that. Moving on to thermals, and for this test I decided to stress the card using TimeSpy Extreme's second benchmark on loop for an hour. At stock, we see the Asus ROG Strix RTX 3090 maintain an average GPU temp of around 65 degrees Celsius and peaked at just 67. For out-of-the-box thermals, those are excellent figures. If you have a case with good airflow and ventilation, you can expect this 3090 to run decently cool under operation. However, do note that Asus has implemented a rather aggressive fan curve. I don't have a sound meter to measure this, but the fans at stock spin at around 1800 to 1900 RPM under load. Now this wasn't terribly loud, but was noticeable. However, if you're someone who games with a headset, then most of the sound will be drowned out, and this shouldn't be much of an issue. I just wanted to point that out because under load my MSI RTX 3080 was basically inaudible, but to be fair, we are dealing with a more power-hungry card. Now, once overclocked, the temps do climb quite a bit higher. We're looking at 74 degrees Celsius for the average GPU temp, and it peaked at 78. And at this point, the fans were spinning at around 2600 to 2700 RPM, and at this point, the GPU was very loud. Even with a headset on, I could hear it, and it was very annoying. So just be aware that once overclocked, the card will run very loud if you're utilizing the stock fan curve and aren't going to set your own. Up next, we're going to be taking a look at some GPU synthetic benchmarks. The first application on our list is 3DMark's Firestrike Ultra. This is a heavy graphics benchmark which utilizes the DirectX 11 API at 4K. When looking at the graphics score, the RTX 3090 here manages to attain 12,611 points, which is 15% higher than the RTX 3080. Not a huge difference considering we're looking at over double the price. For our next test, we have TimeSpy Extreme, a benchmark similar to Firestrike, but this one utilizes the DirectX 12 API. Here, the 3090 scores 10,346, which when compared to the 3080 is about 14% higher, so similar margins as our previous benchmark. After that, we have Unigine Superposition, and we're also just looking at a 14% difference between the 3090 and 3080, so it's nothing spectacular. Now it's time for a couple of real-world tests, and for our first test, we have Blender, which is a very popular open-source 3D application used by content creators for producing work in areas such as 3D modeling, animation, simulations, and more. Blender can take advantage of Nvidia's CUDA platform to leverage these graphics cards to accelerate rendering. Now previously I've noticed that Blender does love the Ampere architecture, where both the 3080 and 3060 Ti trounced the previous generation Turing RTX 2080 Super. Unfortunately, when we compare the 3090 to the 3080, the difference really isn't all that impressive. Here we're looking at a 10-second improvement. Next up, we have V-Ray, a computer-generated imagery rendering software developed by Bulgarian Chaos Group. It's a great piece of 3D technology that can be implemented within widely used programs throughout the animation and modeling industry. The V-Ray benchmark was done using only the GPU, and here the program measures how long it will take your hardware to render the scene, and this is done by measuring the amount of MPATs. And the application, the 3090, shows us the highest margin that we've seen from all the other tests so far, where it's been measured at 797 MPATs, which is about 25% higher than the RTX 3080. Alright, so now that we've gotten those 3D synthetics and rendering benchmarks out of the way, it's time we looked at gaming performance. For all gaming benchmarks, I decided to only just stick with 4K, as really the results from this resolution will tell you everything that you need to know about the 3090's gaming performance, and there's another reason why I decided to stick with just one res, as you'll see later. Also, do note that the games were tested with their very high or ultra preset. So starting with our gaming benchmarks, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a beautiful third-person action-adventure title. Here the 3090 only manages to attain 95 FPS average and 88 for the 1% lows. When compared to the RTX 3080, that's barely noticeable. A 7 and 6% improvement respectively. So yeah, not a whole lot of improvement considering this is over double the price, and that is just really disappointing to see, but let's move on and see the rest. Up next, we're taking a look at Hitman 2, and here we're seeing the RTX 3090 ahead by 12% over the 3080 for the average FPS attained, but it's the 1% lows that are showing us a much bigger margin. Here we're looking at a difference of 29%. Not sure exactly as to why that might be, perhaps it could be due to the larger memory buffer. Moving on, and we have Far Cry New Dawn. Here the 1% lows from the RTX 3090 barely improved over the RTX 3080, the opposite of what we just previously saw. Though in terms of average FPS, there is a 10 FPS difference between the two GPUs. Regardless, with the figures seen here, the RTX 3080 seems to show amazing bang for the buck performance compared to its bigger expensive brother, the 3090, which isn't noticeably ahead or anything. In the Division 2, we're seeing nearly the exact same performance when we compare the 3090 against the RTX 3080, which really isn't a good look for it. That 6% difference will not be noticeable at all to the user, unlike that large gaping hole that's left in their bank account. Moving on, and we have Forza Horizon 4, one of my favorite open world racing titles that looks absolutely phenomenal. Here we're seeing some pretty decent performance from the RTX 3090. Being able to manage 153 FPS average at 4K in a title that looks this good is fantastic. With that said though, the 3080 isn't too far behind. However, note that this is another title which shows us much larger margins when it comes to 1% low results. Still at 109 FPS for the 3080, that isn't bad in any way, very good actually. Also check out the mid-range 3060 Ti, it would also deliver a pretty fantastic smooth experience at 4K in this title. Gears 5 is another one of Microsoft's first party IPs. In this title, we're not really seeing a huge difference between the 3090 and 3080. Again, I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but I'll say it again, those performance differences really won't be that much noticeable to the user, which sucks considering how much more expensive it is. Horizon Zero Dawn, however, is another title that shows us good GPU scaling. Here the RTX 3090 is 21% faster in regards to the average frame rate, and is showing us a larger margin for the 1% lows at 38%. Here I can say that the 3090 will show the user a noticeably smoother experience. It's still not enough to justify its price increase, but at least it's something a bit more worthwhile this time, and not like the measly 5 FPS increases we've seen in other titles. Borderlands 3 is next, and here we're back to the usual single-digit percentage improvements. This is really nothing to write home about, and you could practically call that a tie between the RTX 3080 and RTX 3090, so let's move on. For Watch Dogs Legion, there's just a 13% improvement when it comes to the average frame rate, being able to maintain an average of 60 FPS. The 1% lows, however, barely improved, so performance still wouldn't be all that much consistent and smooth. Assassin's Creed Valhalla shows us a similar story as what we just saw at Watch Dogs Legion. The difference between the RTX 3090 and 3080 here is just a mere 5 FPS for the averages, and 3 FPS for the 1% lows. Remedy Games Control is next, and this game is another one of those titles that doesn't show us a huge performance uplift for the average frame rate, but we do see a significant difference in regards to the 1% lows. Here we're looking at a whopping 35% performance improvement, resulting in a more smoother and more consistent experience with the RTX 3090. Red Dead Redemption 2 is the next game on our list, and here we're seeing the same kind of performance figures as we just saw from other titles. The RTX 3090 is barely faster than the RTX 3080. The last game on our list is Death Stranding, and while 111 FPS average at 4K is impressive, what's also impressive is the 3080 delivering 88% of that performance for less than half the cost, which then undermines the RTX 3090 and doesn't make it all that impressive. Alright, so it's time we finally looked at the 13 game average, and to nobody's surprise, the results are pretty much where you'd expect them to be. When it comes to the average frame rate, the RTX 3090 is just 10% faster than the RTX 3080, and when it comes to 1% lows, we're looking at a 12% margin. And this is why I decided to only benchmark at 4K, because at lower resolutions like 1440p and 1080p, the margins would have been even smaller, making the 3090 look like an absolute joke. I'll be straight with you guys, even though I had already said this way back even before the 3090 hit store shelves, but for gamers, the RTX 3090 just doesn't make any sense at all. I cannot recommend this card in any way. We're talking about a measly 10% performance uplift over the 3080 for double the cost. Even if I was using the cheaper RTX 3090 Founders Edition and had managed to somehow get it at $1,500 US MSRP, my opinion wouldn't change at all. Like I said, the performance differences are pretty much negligible. If I was to do a blind test between these two cards, I'm 100% confident nobody would be able to tell the difference. Now, my review mostly focuses on gaming performance, and sure, some people will be quick to say that the RTX 3090 has other use cases like content creation where it shines, where its larger memory buffer and all those 10,496 CUDA cores can be leveraged. However, let's not forget that in Nvidia's own unveiling, a good chunk of their presentation focused on the 3090's gaming performance. It's advertised as a gaming card and is being judged as a gaming card, where it fails miserably to offer anything meaningful over the RTX 3080. The RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio currently goes for about $850 US. Meanwhile, this Strix RTX 3090 is listed for a whopping $2,019. So now you tell me, 10% performance difference for an extra $1,170. Don't buy this card if all you're going to be doing is just gaming. Get yourself the 3080. Also, the other thing I wanted to talk about was that this is why I'm not enthusiastic about an upcoming RTX 3080 Ti or RTX 3080 Super, because when the 3090 and 3080 are already so damn close, the margin is so narrow, where are those GPUs even going to fit? Even if the 3080 Ti comes out with 20 gigabytes for like $1,000, I still won't be able to recommend it because for a couple $100 lower, you can get pretty much the same performance. Anyways, going back to the topic on hand, let's check out overclocking performance. For my overclock settings, I was able to set a 120 MHz offset to the core and plus 1000 MHz to the memory and MSI Afterburner. We'll first take a look at performance improvement in 3D Mark Times by Extreme Benchmark. The RTX 3090 OC shows an improvement of 9% over stock. In terms of gaming performance, we've got Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and when overclocked, the 3090 pushes its average frame rate from 95 FPS to 104, so that's a 9% improvement. A similar margin as what we saw in the synthetic benchmark, so that's pretty good. As for the 1% lows, it's nothing big, just a 5 FPS improvement. Now, while that might seem like a good result from overclocking, it becomes very underwhelming when we take into account just how much more power this thing is drawing, so let's take a look at power consumption. For measuring power consumption, I had used Times by Extreme second benchmark on loop for an hour. Here we can see for average power draw, there's a 21% increase where the GPU went from consuming 381 watts on average to 462 watts. Man, what a monster. I remember back when we had Crossfire and SLI setups that would use that much power, and now we're talking about a single GPU solution. This thing is an absolute monstrosity. On top of that, the GPU did peak at 480 watts, which is the peak power limit. Unfortunately, performance didn't scale all that well with the substantial power increase. And like I had mentioned earlier in this video, it also makes the GPU run very loud, so it's not worth it as the stock performance is already good enough relative to what this OC got me. Alright, the last thing I wanted to take a look at was ray tracing and DLSS performance, hoping that perhaps there would be some redemption here, that with Nvidia's most touted feature is where the 3090 would shine, and unfortunately it fails to deliver here as well. To start off, we've got a synthetic benchmark 3D Mark Port Royal, which utilizes DXR. Here the 3090 scores 12,847 points, making it just 11% faster than the 3080. So again, nothing home to write about. As for gaming performance, I'm just going to throw up the graphs there on screen for you guys. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, most of the performance margins seen here are similar to what we saw with the native performance. Sure, the 3090 is faster, but there's nothing substantial about its performance increase. The 3080 for the most part can deliver the same performance. And this is a game with just RTX on, performance absolutely tanks, so I was hoping to at least see the RTX 3090 showcase some playable performance without the need of DLSS, but alas, it continues to disappoint. Watch Dogs Legion is more of the same, where the 3090 isn't really showing us any meaningful performance over the less expensive 3080. This is probably the most underwhelming and most disappointing PC component I've ever reviewed. I'm not entirely sure as to why that is, but Ampere shows us some really poor scaling with hardware, considering this GPU has over double the VRAM, a wider memory bus, over 20% more shaders, yet we rarely saw any performance differences reflect that. And the elephant in the room is the price. Like I said earlier, considering this thing costs anywhere from double or over double the price, it's just not justifiable if you're a gamer when the 3080 can deliver like 90% of its performance. So my advice, don't buy it unless you know for sure your workload will take full advantage of this GPU, or you're just, a big baller who doesn't know what else to do with his wad of cash. I hope you guys found this video to be informative and helpful. Let me know your thoughts down below. Check out the video description on ways to support the channel and for my other videos. If you guys are interested in more content like this, then make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one.